US thought tariffs would revive its auto industry, but they sparked a silent war with Japan. They didn't hit China, they struck a loyal ally. And Japan's response wasn't anger, it was a master plan to outsmart America. On April 3, 2025, the United States ignited a fire it believed would fuel a manufacturing comeback. A 25% tariff on vehicles from Mexico and Canada was unveiled with patriotic zeal, pitched as a decisive blow to bring jobs home, curb trade exploitation, and rally voters. The White House called it a precision strike against economic rivals, with pundits applauding and crowds roaring. But in the haze of political showmanship, America misfired, wounding not its intended target, but Japan, a trusted ally whose cars, Toyota Camrys, Honda Civics, Nissan Rogues, fill 37% of US driveways. This wasn't a policy hiccup. It was a betrayal that turned a partner into a strategist, exposing the cracks in America's auto empire. The data tells a grim tale. In 2024, Japanese automakers produced 3.2 million vehicles in North America, with 60% from Mexico and Canada, supporting 109,000 US jobs through suppliers, logistics, and dealerships. Toyota's San Antonio plant, Honda's Ontario hub, and Nissan's Aguascalientes facility weren't foreign outposts. They were economic lifelines, woven into America's industrial fabric. Yet, the tariffs cut deep. By the second quarter of 2025, US auto imports from Mexico fell 8%, and Canada's exports dropped 27%. Designed to protect Detroit, the policy instead left it stranded. GM and Ford saw no sales surge, having abandoned compact and hybrid markets for gas-hungry trucks and SUVs. With gas prices at $4.10 per gallon, consumers clamored for Japan's efficient vehicles, now pricier and delayed. Honda Civic prices rose $2,800, with wait times hitting 60 days, frustrating buyers and dealers alike. The error wasn't just economic, it was a diplomatic disaster. Japan, a US ally since the 1950s, had built its North American plants to align with American interests, employing US workers and fueling local economies. The tariffs didn't just hike costs, they broke trust. In Tokyo, a senior executive reportedly shut a laptop and said, "They pulled the trigger." This wasn't a trade policy. It was a declaration of war, and Japan's silence wasn't surrender. It was the calm before a brilliant counterstrike. Washington thought it was playing chess. Tokyo saw a battlefield, and it was already 3 moves ahead. Japan didn't fight the US tariffs. They rewrote the global auto industry. They had a plan ready for 7 years. And it wasn't about revenge, it was about leaving America in the dust. While Washington basked in its tariff victory, Japan didn't blink. Within 72 hours of April 3, 2025, Japanese automakers executed a playbook honed since 2018, when America First threats first surfaced. This wasn't a reaction, it was a surgical pivot. Honda rerouted Civic hybrid production from Mexico to Indiana, not to appease the US, but to lock in market access. Nissan slashed Rogue SUV production in Japan by 20%, redirecting capacity to global hubs. Toyota fast-tracked EV and hybrid lines to Thailand and Japan, cutting North American reliance by 15%. This was no frantic scramble, it was logistics warfare, each move as precise as a samurai's strike. By June 2025, Japan shifted 30% of its US-bound production to Southeast Asia, with Thailand, Vietnam, and Indonesia becoming new powerhouses. The logic was brutal. Labor costs in Thailand were 40% lower than Mexico. Regulations were smoother, and these nations didn't spring surprise tariffs. Toyota's Thailand plants boosted Corolla hybrid output by 25%, while Nissan's Vietnam facilities added 15,000 compact EVs annually. Honda's Indonesia hub scaled CR-V production by 18%, targeting export markets. This wasn't just about savings, it was a geopolitical fortress, shielding Japan from US volatility. Southeast Asia became Japan's manufacturing bastion, a firewall against unpredictable trade policies. The numbers are jaw-dropping. In 2024, Japan invested $12 billion in Southeast Asian auto infrastructure, By Q3 2025, that soared to $20 billion. Thailand's auto exports to the U.S. surged 28%, dodging tariffs entirely. Meanwhile, U.S. dealerships faced a 15% spike in delivery delays and 10% price hikes on Japanese models. Buyers grumbled, but loyalty held. Japanese brands kept a 36% U.S. market share, even under siege. Japan didn't just adapt, it dominated, turning a trade war into a masterclass in strategy. The genius was in the groundwork. Since 2018, Japan stress-tested its supply chains, mapping every weak link in global manufacturing. When tariffs hit, they didn't flinch, they executed. The EU deepened trade ties, offering Japan 15% tariff-free EV access. South Korea and Singapore became battery supply hubs, cutting U.S. dependence. This was no improvisation. It was a symphony of foresight, with Japan conducting while America played catch-up. Japan's silence wasn't weakness. It was the sound of a nation outsmarting its rival. Japan didn't just dodge tariffs, they redefined the future of cars. They're building batteries America can't match. And it's not about today's sales, it's about owning 2030. Japan's counterstrike wasn't just about moving factories, it was about outthinking the competition with innovation as its weapon. Tariffs couldn't stop progress, and Japan brandished its technological edge like a blade. Toyota accelerated its solid-state battery program, aiming for a 2027 launch with 600-mile ranges and 10-minute charge times, a leap that would leave Tesla and GM in the rearview. Nissan scaled up compact EVs, targeting urban markets with 50,000 units planned for 2026, a segment Detroit abandoned. Honda secured next-gen battery components from South Korea and Singapore, slashing costs by 12% and bypassing U.S. suppliers. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment pivot, it was rooted in years of preparation. Since 2018, Japan poured $45 billion into EV and hybrid R&D, dwarfing GM and Ford's combined $32 billion. By 2025, Toyota owned 22% of global EV battery patents, compared to Tesla's 15%. Nissan's Ariya EV outsold Ford's Mustang Mach-E by 18% in Europe, while Honda's e-One captured 10% of Asia's compact EV market. These weren't just cars, they were proof Japan could innovate faster and smarter. America, meanwhile, was stuck in neutral. U.S. automakers managed only 8% EV sales in 2025, against Japan's 22%. Detroit's focus on trucks and SUVs left it exposed as gas prices hit $4.10 per gallon, driving demand for Japan's efficient vehicles. U.S. EV infrastructure funding languished at $7.5 billion, while Japan's $20 billion public-private push built charging networks and battery labs. While Washington debated, Japan delivered. Japan's edge wasn't just tech, it was trust. In a 2025 J.D. Power survey, 90% of U.S. consumers called Japanese brands most reliable, versus 65% for American brands. When tariffs raised prices, buyers waited, proving loyalty was Japan's shield. Toyota absorbed 40% of tariff costs through financing deals, stabilizing Camry sales. Nissan's lease incentives kept rogue demand strong. This wasn't just business, it was a psychological coup, cementing Japan's hold on American drivers. Japan wasn't fighting for today, it was claiming tomorrow's roads. The U.S. tariffs were meant to save jobs, but they broke America's auto heartland. Thousands of U.S. workers lost their livelihoods, and Japan didn't fight back, they just walked away. The tariffs' pain didn't scream from headlines. It bled quietly in America's industrial core. By July 2025, 12,000 U.S. auto supplier jobs were gone, from Michigan's parts plants to Texas's logistics hubs. Toyota's San Antonio plant cut shifts by 20%, shaking a community tied to its 7,000 workers. Honda's Ohio suppliers saw a 15% revenue plunge, while Nissan's Tennessee partners laid off 800. These weren't statistics. They were shattered lives, crushed by a policy that missed its mark. U.S. dealerships reeled, grappling with $1.2 billion in delayed inventory costs. Honda Civic prices jumped $3,000 with 90-day wait times. Toyota RAV 4 deliveries lagged 2 months, with 10% price hikes frustrating buyers. Yet, American automakers couldn't step up. GM and Ford had ditched compact cars years ago, chasing trucks and SUVs that didn't fit a world of $4.10 gas. U.S. auto sales grew just 2% in Q2 2025, while Japanese brands held a 36% market share despite the chaos. The policy meant to lift Detroit crushed its ecosystems instead. The real wound was trust. Japan, a U.S. ally for 70 years, had invested $160 billion in American manufacturing since the 1980s, building cars for U.S. tastes and workers. The tariffs were a betrayal, a slap to a partner who played by the rules. Japan's response wasn't loud, it was chilling. By Q3 2025, Japan's Ministry of Finance cut U.S. Treasury bond purchases by 5%, a $60 billion shift signaling, "We're done relying on you." Toyota's Texas HQ reportedly eyed relocation, threatening 7,000 jobs. The irony stung. Tariffs sold as a win for workers crippled the very systems they aimed to save. Michigan saw 30% of suppliers issue profit warnings, and Texas lost 10% of auto-related tax revenue. Washington spun the story, but empty lots and silent phones told the truth. This wasn't a trade war. It was a mirror, showing how fragile America's auto dominance had become. Japan didn't just survive tariffs, they're building the auto world of 2030. They're shipping cars from places America can't touch. And it's not about beating the US, it's about outliving it. Japan didn't just endure the tariff storm, it reshaped the global chessboard. By late 2025, 40% of Japan's US-bound exports came from Southeast Asia, beyond tariff reach. Thailand's auto output for the US soared 28%. With Vietnam and Indonesia adding 20,000 vehicles monthly. The EU-Japan trade pact deepened, granting 15% tariff-free EV access. South Korea and Taiwan mirrored Japan's moves, forming an Asian bloc against US unpredictability. This wasn't revenge, it was a leap forward. The numbers scream ambition. Japan's $30 billion EV investment by 2027 targets 25% of the global EV market, against U.S. automakers' 12%. Toyota's solid-state batteries, tested in 2025, promise affordability, while Nissan's compact EVs aim at urban buyers. Honda's deals with LG Chem and CATL secure batteries without U.S. reliance. Japan's focus isn't today's sales, it's tomorrow's roads. America plays a losing game. U.S. trade policy's chaos, with 2025's stalled $5 billion EV incentives, hobbles progress. American automakers hold just 10% of battery patents against Japan's 22%. Detroit's truck obsession fails as consumer needs shift, and U.S. charging infrastructure trails Japan's by 30%. Japan doesn't fight, it endures. When Accords ship from Hanoi, it's a lesson. Engineers outbuild politicians. Japan's playbook is global. Seoul, Taipei, and Berlin emulate Tokyo, blending diversification and innovation. Japan's $18 billion Southeast Asian investment makes Thailand an auto hub, while the EU's $10 billion deal locks in Western markets. This isn't about cars, it's about power. Japan's message, "We don't need to fight. We'll outthink you." While America chases headlines, Japan builds 2030. U.S. tariffs aimed at autos, but they're rattling America's spirits industry. Whiskey exports soared despite the chaos. But fear of EU retaliation could sober up the party. The U.S. tariffs on vehicles, launched on April 3, 2025, were meant to reshape the auto industry, but their shockwaves reached far beyond the factory floor, rattling America's spirits sector. U.S. spirits exports rose 10% in 2024 to $2.4 billion, driven by a surge in demand from the European Union, the largest market for American whiskey. American whiskey, accounting for 54% of U.S. spirits exports, saw its value climb to $1.3 billion, despite a 5.4% dip in volume. This growth, however, unfolded under the shadow of President Donald Trump's trade policies, which sparked fears of retaliatory tariffs that could choke the industry's momentum. The spirits sector, like the auto industry, became an unintended casualty in a trade war that's rewriting global commerce. The numbers tell a story of resilience amid uncertainty. Since the EU suspended its 25% retaliatory tariff on American whiskey in 2022, exports to Europe surged nearly 60% to $699 million in 2024, up from $439 million in 2021. This boom was no accident. Distillers stockpiled shipments anticipating the EU might reinstate tariffs as high as 50% by March 2025 if no trade deal is reached. The Distilled Spirits Council of the United States, DISCUS, hailed the EU's decision not to reimpose tariffs as a positive first step toward zero-for-zero trade, but warned that ongoing trade disputes unrelated to our sector keep distillers on edge. Chris Swanger, DISCUS president, noted that uncertainty has sidelined distillers, curbing sales growth and investment. The parallels with Japan's auto strategy are striking. Both industries, caught in the crossfire, leaned on foresight and adaptability to navigate the storm. Yet, the spirits industry faces unique vulnerabilities. Unlike Japan's automakers, who pivoted to Southeast Asia, U.S. distillers can't easily relocate production. Whiskey, tied to American terroir and tradition, relies on exports to thrive, with the EU accounting for 29% of U.S. spirit sales. A return of EU tariffs could raise prices, dent demand, and erode market share to competitors like Scotch and Irish whiskey. In 2018, when the EU last imposed tariffs, U.S. whiskey exports to Europe fell 20%, a warning of what's at stake. The broader trade war, fueled by Trump's 25% tariffs on steel, aluminum, and autos, risks dragging spirits into a fight they didn't start. Canada's 25% retaliatory tariff on U.S. spirits, enacted in response to earlier levies, already stings, with $20 billion in U.S. imports targeted. The spirits industry, like Japan's auto giants, is learning that in a trade war, no sector is safe. The human cost is real. Small distilleries in Kentucky and Tennessee, employing thousands, fear a tariff-driven slump could force layoffs. In 2024, the U.S. spirits industry supported 1.6 million jobs, but prolonged trade disputes could erode this base. Like the auto suppliers in Michigan, these workers are collateral damage in a policy aimed elsewhere. DISCUS is pushing for negotiations to untangle spirits from the trade war, echoing Japan's quiet diplomacy. But with Trump pausing some tariffs for 90 days while keeping auto levies intact, the future remains murky. This isn't just about whiskey, it's about trust, and whether America's trade gambit will cost more than it gains. Canada refuses to bow to U.S. tariffs on its auto industry. Trump said he didn't want Canadian cars at all. But Prime Minister Mark Carney says Canada, not Trump, calls the shots. As Japan pivoted to outmaneuver U.S. tariffs, Canada took a different path: defiance. On April 24, 2025, Prime Minister Mark Carney stood in Port Moody, British Columbia, and dismissed President Donald Trump's claim that he didn't want Canadian cars in the U.S. market. "This is Canada. We decide what happens here," Carney declared, rejecting Trump's vision of sidelining Canada's auto sector. The 25% U.S. tariff on Canadian vehicles, effective April 3, 2025, aimed to curb imports, but it struck a nerve in a nation whose auto industry is a cornerstone of its economy. Canada exported $51 billion in vehicles in 2023, with 93% bound for the U.S., making it the second largest export after oil. Carney's stand mirrors Japan's resilience, but swaps silence for vocal resistance. The stakes are immense. Canada's auto sector, concentrated in Ontario's automotive capital of Windsor, supports 120,000 direct jobs and 400,000 indirect jobs, deeply integrated with U.S. supply chains. In 2024, automotive imports to the U.S. totaled $474 billion, with Canada among the top suppliers alongside Japan and Mexico. The tariffs, part of Trump's reciprocal trade policy, threaten this symbiosis. Carney warned of a U.S. recession, predicting a major negative effect on Canada, as J.P. Morgan estimated new car prices could rise $4,000 to $5,300. Like Japan's automakers, Canadian producers face higher costs and delays. But unlike Japan, Canada lacks the global production flexibility to reroute at scale. Carney's strategy is to fight, not flee, vowing retaliatory tariffs to protect workers. Canada's response is both economic and political. Carney's Liberal Party, facing an April 28th election, has made the tariff fight a rallying cry, with polls showing Trump's threats as Canadians' top concern. Canada imposed $20 billion in retaliatory tariffs on U.S. goods. This is Canada. We decide what happens here. Carney's rhetoric echoes Japan's quiet resolve, but is louder, leveraging national pride to galvanize voters. Ontario Premier Doug Ford's talks with U.S. officials hinted at compromises, suggesting tariffs might apply only to Canadian-made parts, not entire vehicles. Yet Carney's broader plan includes reducing reliance on the U.S., echoing Japan's diversification. By July 1, 2025, Canada aims for free internal trade, harmonizing regulations to cut costs by 15% and boost the economy by 4 to 8%. This mirrors Japan's Southeast Asian pivot, but focuses inward, strengthening Canada's resilience. The United States thought a 25% tariff would bend the auto world to its will, but it misfired, hitting ally Japan and sparking a silent war. Instead of kneeling, Japan pivoted with surgical brilliance, shifting 40% of its US-bound production to Southeast Asia, securing 36% of the US market and claiming 22% of global EV battery patents. Toyota's solid-state batteries, Nissan's compact EVs, and Honda's Asian supply chains aren't just products. They're proof of a nation that outthought its rival. Meanwhile, America pays the price. 12,000 lost jobs, $1.2 billion in dealership delays, and a betrayed ally quietly reducing $60 billion in U.S. bond purchases. Detroit watches from the sidelines, crippled by its own policy, as consumers face higher prices and empty lots. This wasn't a trade skirmish. It was a masterclass in resilience, with Japan playing for 2030 while America chases headlines. The lesson? Break trust, and the world reroutes. Silently, brilliantly, permanently. Japan didn't need to shout. Its factories, patents, and patience spoke louder. As the new accord ships from Hanoi, the message is clear. Engineers outbuild politicians, and the future belongs to those who plan, not those who posture. You've seen the playbook behind the headlines. Now stay ahead of the game. Subscribe to decode the moves shaping tomorrow's world, from trade wars to tech revolutions. Join the 1% who don't just watch the news but understand it. Hit that button, share this video, and follow us for the stories others miss. The next shift is coming. Will you see it first? Let's unravel the future together, one silent victory at a time.